context for this project, I think a lot of you have been to other events where we've talked about things. So this is the, so this is on behalf of the Ad Hoc Committee to Reimagine the Public Safety Review Board. I'm just going to share screen so we can take a look at the presentation. So we've shared this with the faculty, and now it's sort of time to get feedback from the undergraduate student body as a whole. So over the past few months, we've been having these conversations about public safety, about policing in our community, and in particular about the Public Safety Review Board. So I think to start off, like, what is the Public Safety Review Board? Basically, it is the body that is able to approve policy decisions from public safety. So for example, if you're all familiar with what happened last year, the year before last year, public safety came to the board with a proposal. They wanted to arm more officers. And then the Public Safety Review Board decided to form a subcommittee that was going to investigate and look at the evidence and look at the research as to whether or not this was a legitimate thing. They voted. There was a mixed vote, but overall it was no. And then it went back to the Public Safety Review Board. The Public Safety Review Board voted themselves. They voted yes, and then it went to the president's office. And although the interim President Feldman did not approve to arm more DPS officers, what they did approve was unrestricted supervisor access. If you were there at the previous meeting, we went through some policies there, but I think this meeting in particular, we want to talk about the board itself, its composition, and the draft proposal that we have right now. Where's the present button? Let's see.
Slideshow.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Cool.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's in like the presenter form. You know what I mean?
Place. There we go. Cool.
Okay. Cool.
All right. Are we recording? Yes, we are. Great. So the Ad Hoc Committee to Reimagine the Public Safety Review Board was formed by the Faculty Senate. It's chaired by Thomas Gibson, and on this committee, it has representatives from the undergraduate student body, faculty, administrators, service workers, as well as community members. So we met on these dates, and there was a remarkable degree of agreement about what this new Public Safety Review Board would have to be.
Yeah, so the same committee that has met on those days, we are drafting a proposal for a better review board, a reimagined version of it. So we do have a draft that we will be showing to you guys soon. This proposal is designed in response to what has been going on, the structural racism that is endemic to policing in American culture, as well as so close to our campus, and as well as the outside skirts of campus that public safety intervenes on or polices on. So the new Public Safety Review Board needs to be a part of a wider institutional effort that embraces anti-racism, community partnerships, restore justice, conflict mediation, and non-extractive economic development in the city of Rochester. So please bear that in mind when we are speaking about what should the proposal also include.
Yeah, so when we're thinking about what it will actually do, here are the purposes that we came up with, or here are the items that it'll have to do. So right now we identify the first problem. The first problem is that students have no idea how to file reports if they have a bad experience with DPS. And when we say file reports, I don't mean just hey, I had this bad time, I'm going to talk to my friends about it. I mean file reports in a way that actually secures accountability as some kind of mechanism where we know that public safety is going to take this seriously, public safety is going to actually do something about it, or administration will take it seriously and do something about it. So given this, we want the Public Safety Review Board to be able to disseminate information about public safety. So questions that we keep asking of who is armed in public safety, where do they go, what's the difference between the medical center, Eastman campus, and River campus, what are its policies and other relevant information, diversity, processes, et cetera, training. So we think that that's important because if we know more things about public safety, we're better able to hold them accountable for things. We are also able to advocate for more specific changes. For example, we looked at this particular policy, I think it's policy 420, It doesn't allow students to know the outcome of their complaint, even until the very end. More deeply understanding decisions like that and policies like that. The second thing we wanted to do is provide a venue for independent submission and review of complaints. So right now, what happens when you file a complaint to DPS? So say something bad happens, and you have a negative interaction with a public safety officer. What you end up doing, you have two options. You can file a bias-related incident report, which then is handled by the Burgett Intercultural Center and their processes, or you can call DPS directly or email them and literally just be like, hey, I had a really bad time. But obviously, if you've had a lot of negative interactions with DPS, that's probably not the best way. You're probably going to feel really uncomfortable about calling them to file a complaint. We think that this is rather unlikely. And then even if you trust DPS to somehow review itself, there's a structural sort of like question there, right? It's like, okay, well, like, do you trust them to implement that themselves? What happens if someone in that process chooses to ignore it or chooses to dismiss it? Et cetera, et cetera. So we think that there should be an independent submission process through the Public Safety Review Board, which will not be done by DPS officers. So the third thing is like more to speak to the community thing, right? Like we want this board to actively solicit feedback and suggestions from the university and neighboring communities that aim at this like broad conception of safety that that Stephen mentioned before, right? So like this basically means that we don't want the Public Safety Review Board to be in a vacuum. Most students don't know that it exists. Most students don't realize where policy comes from regarding DPS. In the status quo, what happens is people in DPS are like, okay, we think that this should happen. And then that policy proposal goes to the Public Safety Review Board, and then it gets discussed and voted on, and then it goes to the president's office to be implemented. So couple of problems. Who sits on the Public Safety Review Board right now? Mostly administrators, mostly, not students. There is one student sitting on the Public Safety Review Board, and every year it is always the president of the Students Association, of the River Campus Students Association. So yeah, what we want to have is that expanded ability to solicit feedback and suggestions. The next thing is to make recommendations regarding policy proposals. So basically what I said earlier, right? Like policies come from DPS and almost nowhere else. We think that there should be policies that are brought to the table by community members, by students, by anyone who is part of the U of R community. That's pretty clear. And then we added one additional thing. So as a senator, I spent a lot of time trying to locate the DPS budget. I located it. It was password protected. I asked for the password. I asked if I could see it. They did not let me see it. Makes sense, I guess. But yeah, we want to give the Public Safety Review Board the ability to review the budget and to propose changes in the allocations of resources. So for example, if we think that, mental health is a really big issue, and we think that, DPS is spending money doing XYZ that's supposed to address mental health, but we feel like that's not necessary, we want to be able to propose a reallocation of those funds somewhere else. So for example, UCC, et cetera.
So alongside that, we want the review board to produce its own annual public report that one assesses the data presented in the annual DPS report. So not only the budget, but a whole bunch of information like the activities, the complaints and resolutions that people bring up when concerning DPS, and policy recommendations, amendments to reporting structures, any initiatives to engage with the larger Rochester community. So not only us, but the same places like the 19th Ward and Plex that DPS polices around, and yeah, just polices around.
Cool. So in regards to like the board itself, so we would like the new board to be a lot larger, but the way that it's conducted, we want it to have an executive committee and then a full board. So the way that this is structured is similar to the Board of Trustees. It'll be a total of about 40 people, and then there's an executive committee that is elected, and then you'll have co-chairs, and they sort of direct meetings. Although, yeah. So with that said, the reason why we think this is fine, having a large number of people, is because at the end of the day, we want every policy proposal, every discussion of like, we want to arm public safety more, or we want to divert funding from this to this, et cetera, et cetera. We want every single person who is a vulnerable member of the community, or even a member of the community who has like a greater stake in this than somebody, say like a board of trustee member who doesn't really frequently who doesn't live on campus, for example. We want them to have their voices heard, and that creating this structure will allow that to happen institutionally instead of just like relying on them to reach out to students, which I don't believe they have in the past, which is why we've had a lot of like which is why, like, I guess in the history of U of R, there have been related protest actions. So the full members of the board will represent all of these groups. So not just administrators, but faculty, staff, students, workers, and community members from all of the campuses. And it would include all 7 schools of the university, and will definitely include those representing the IPOC, LGBTQ+, deaf persons, and persons with disabilities. So it'll be really important that this happens. Yeah.
So breaking down into what we have in the proposal so far about the review board's membership and how will that be structured. So we're trying to find a representation of all the different identities and places that the DPS governs on, or just like polices over. So that right now what we have is 4 non-voting ex officio members representing DPS chain of command, diversity, equity, and inclusion, 9 faculty members representing the 3 main campuses and the 7 schools of the university, as Amanda said, 7 undergraduate students representing both River and Eastman School of Music, 5 graduate students representing the 3 campuses, 4 staff members representing the Genesee Staff Council, bias-related executive team, the Employee Assistant Program, and registered nurses at Strong Memorial Hospital, 4 service workers representing the 3 campuses, and 4 community members representing neighborhood associations. I didn't do the math, but that's yeah, that's plenty of people right there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Amanda, Steven, for your presentation. Now we move into clarifying questions. There's one question in chat that, well, if you didn't make an answer, is public annual reports now already published?
So there is a public annual report, but it's conducted by DPS in order for them to be compliant with New York State regulations. What the Public Safety Review Board would do is to produce its own annual report. It wouldn't be like it would be a separate independent report that assesses the data that's given in the DPS report itself. So it'll talk more about the trends instead of just releasing numbers and statistics. It'll also do the 2 other things mentioned in the bullets. So it'll summarize other sources of information about activities, complaints, and resolutions. So it would probably be, I guess, like pulling, it would be more of that discussion of like, what do these numbers mean instead of raw data itself. And then from there, it also has the power. So the reason why we want this structure to produce a report is because actions at the university and changes at the university as a whole are often first initially based on data, numbers, surveys, and reports. So if the DPS report is likely not going to recommend that funding be allocated to something else, whereas the Public Safety Review Board is able to make a recommendation that says, most calls on campus are for lockouts. We allocate X amount of funding to all of these other activities that DPS does that are not lockouts. This seems interesting. We recommend that this money be allocated elsewhere. So that's an example of something that could come from the PSRB report that would probably not come from the DPS report itself.
Thank you for answering that question, Amanda. Yeah, it just seemed crazy to me that like students, community members have to go through so much trouble to access this information, and that it's not readily available to see. But I do have another question. I was wondering, like in terms of expanding the board with all of the various members that you guys plan to include, I was wondering if it was possible to bring this to, I feel embarrassed saying this, but I don't know if Rochester has like council, like divisions of the town, but is it possible to bring this to like a council member to present to our, like the community that public safety has jurisdiction over, and how they can play a part in like making sure that there is adequate and effective and like reliable people that can be represented on this board. Yeah, thank you, Anna, for that in the chat.
Yeah, I can add on to so the review board Imagine committee, like, so me and Amanda, as well as like the other people that are in the actual committee, are composed of different identities. So we have faculty, we have staff, we have people from the URMC as well. So like our task was to reach out to various so where our identity comes from, where we're coming from, we had to come to reach out to that group and get the feedback from them. So me and Amanda are here trying to get feedback from undergraduates, but there are people being reached out to URMC, people being reached out to there 2 weeks ago they did it at faculty senate hall as well to get feedback as well. And yeah, 19 that Anna said, 19 community association, as well as Plex, are also being reached out for their suggestions on the proposal as well. So it's not just only like, oh, we're here. We're definitely have been reaching out to the various.
Well, if you have more
question, that was a great question.
Okay. Thank you. If you might have any more clarifying questions, we understand there's a lot of information that's being put at you, but does anybody have any more clarifying questions? If so, put in chat. If you wish to speak, just raise your hand and I'll call upon you. But is any more clarifying questions? Anybody else wishes to speak? We can then. So kind of then, so if nobody wishes to speak and there's a more clarifying question, we kind of move into kind of getting you all gauging gauging you all's kind of perspective as well. The first question I like to pose to the group town hall here is, what should the Eastman student representation look like? I wonder if somebody in this town hall can answer that question. Oh, sorry, excuse me. We have a clarifying question before we answer that. The question was, would you consider the student aid program a place to reallocate funds, even though it's funded by DPS?
These are all really great.
Say again?
Sorry. Yeah, these are all really great questions. I think to answer Bryn's question, would we consider the student aid program a place to reallocate funds? So potentially, I don't think that's I don't think that's for us to say. I think that'll ultimately be a decision that's made by the board or a question to be asked of the board. The key issue is just like whether or not we have representation for students to be heard or for people to be heard on various like sides of that question. In terms of like other responsibilities of the Public Safety Review Board. So currently the Public Safety Review Board is responsible for policy of like, yes, no vote on policies. The second thing that they're responsible for is also in part some of the complaints that go through. So they make some of the decisions of, what happened, like how investigations, so investigations will be conducted. And that's like separate from the board, but they sort of make those decisions regarding like officer discipline, et cetera, et cetera. Does it only make recommendations for the public safety department, or can it make recommendations to solve safety concerns through other means? So the answer to that question is yes, it can make recommendations to solve safety concerns through other means, but that's just what we're proposing right now. So in the status quo, it does not. It basically only interacts with public safety and only interacts with all of the people that are sitting on that review board initially. With the new proposal, we would be able to, well, I guess like if it gets through and passed, we would be able to solve safety concerns through other means. This also addresses the question of how will PSRB help reduce the size, scope, and presence of DPS. So that's the mechanism, right? Basically, like if the goal is to make sure that campus is safe without something like without policing, basically, the PSRB is going to be it's basically going to open a window for student voices to be heard and for abolitionist voices to be heard within what is generally a very opaque structure. So given this is like that initial first step into allowing that conversation to even be had in the first place. So because they have the authority to make decisions regarding the budget or to make recommendations of the budget, of what DPS does, of DPS policy, this is going to be the thing that like allows for that to happen. Yeah, more about internal complaint review process of DPS. So in essay, Devon and I were looking at DPS policy. So I actually, well, I mean, so their internal complaint review process is posted online. They basically say that they take the complaint very seriously and that they go through an independent investigation, and then there's an outcome of the investigation, and that's largely about it. If you want to DM me after this meeting, I can send you the actual documents that we found when we were doing our research. Yeah. So that was a ramble. I just tried to answer all the questions that are popping up.
Do you might have any more questions? Feel free to put in chat. You might wish to speak. Anything, if you don't want to write in chat, you can also say as well. We'll give it a moment for people to kind of think about questions. If there is no more clarifying questions, if there is any more, we'll pop back into clarification discussion. And since I don't see any question coming through, we'll kind of go into our question. So again, Bo's question again, what should the Eastman student representation look like on this review board? And somebody from Eastman or any Eastman students in the chat, I'm in the town hall, excuse me. I would love to hear you speak your input.
Yeah, so I think I'm the only Eastman student here, unfortunately. We just had one, but I think she had to jump into another meeting. But for those of you who don't know, Eastman had a policy change last year that required public safety officers to stand at the front doors and check everyone's IDs when you enter the building. And there has been a lot of, well, racial profiling happening and cases of like the officers only asking certain people for their IDs. And as of right now, there's no really, like, there's no center for students to make these reports, or students just don't know how to, make a report if they do experience something like that. So I think this is really important, especially from the Eastman perspective. I'm hoping that we can get more students involved on this campus. But yeah, that's about it. If anyone has any questions about how Eastman public safety is different, I'd be happy to take a swing at it too.
I think it might make sense to share the actual breakdown of students that's in the proposal. Could we do that? Yes. Okay, I'm just gonna share screen again. And we're gonna, what is it? It's on Chrome. Okay, cool. Can everyone see this document? Oops.
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, so here's the full breakdown. So there are going to be 36. We are proposing that there will be 36 voting members and 4 ex officio members. An ex officio member is just somebody who can attend but does not get a vote. Voting members, you know, yeah. So we're undergraduate students. We're going to take a look at undergraduates right here. So we want, whoops, oh, I can't highlight it. Awkward. Okay. Yeah, so the reason why we want to ask that question is currently this doesn't specify whether or not they are Eastman students or River Campus students. It simply says 2 students representing the Students Association, which I think would mean both. So it could be 1 from River Campus, 1 from Eastman Campus. I'm not sure, though. We would have to like put that in. 2 students representing groups covered by MSAB, which would be on the River campus, 2 students representing historically marginalized groups, and then 1 student representing MERT. So there really isn't any built-in Eastman representation. Does anyone have any thoughts on this in particular?
I mean, like I said, I think it's important to have an Eastman student. In our Students Association, we do have a position we do have 1 student who just handles like DPS. That's their chair position. So maybe reaching out to them would be a good thing. But yeah, we're right downtown. A lot happens down here. Public safety is really involved, not only in the Eastman community, but in like the surrounding area. So I think it would be important to maybe specify 1 Eastman student.
I think this would be a good segue into our second question, which is, how should undergraduate representation be selected for this board, especially those seats who are not already tied to a student organization? So anybody have thoughts, opinions on that? Anybody give a stab at it? What do you think? Student reps, how should student reps be chosen if it's not a student org?
Well, I think one way that I think just being interested in having a voice in the first place could be something worth considering in this process, because I mean, if it's something that somebody cares about, I feel like if somebody cares enough to seek out this type of opportunity to have a voice, I think that they should at least be considered. So I think it should kind of be an open thing. I think that there should definitely be an application process involved one way or another. But at the same time, I do feel like everyone should have at least a chance to be considered.
So in regards to the application process, I think the logical question in my head is like, who would run that applications process? Should it be BIC? Should it be the Students Association? Should it be the board itself?
Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. If you were to go about the application process, like what would you even like, how would you choose who is worthy of and who is not worthy of like being on the board? Like how would you be deciding that?
Does anyone want to try to answer that question? Do you mind repeating the question?
I'm gonna just type it in the chat actually so people can see it. But it was just like, how would you decide using the application process, how would you decide who can be on the board? Like what would you be determining makes somebody worthy of being on the board and somebody not worthy of being on the board?
So I think specifically in terms of applications, if we were to open applications, it would have to be for this category, if you can see the mouse, 2 students representing historically marginalized groups, including these communities. So yeah, that's a great question. That'll definitely be something that we would need to figure out. But that's also why we wanted to like come to students about it. It's like, those are questions that we would like everyone to like try to answer. I think for me, I am not sure. I would prefer not an application process, but I understand that a non-application process makes it really closed. And then it would have to be basically through processes of like, I know someone who knows someone else, which is not great. Yeah, so they would have to be a member of these communities. they would have to be plugged into community resources. They would have to be willing to commit their time to this board, and be willing to sort of like liaise with communities that they're a part of. But those are definitely concerns that we also have. Does anyone else have thoughts?
I'm gonna just add another thought of like, so we're still trying to think of including Eastman as well. So if we have to do application for those communities, it'd have to go for both campuses as well. So just reminding that.
Well, if there is no further discussion on that point. That's good. That's something to something about is how do we choose student reps, and that's something we have to ponder. We can go to the third question here is particularly to undergrad representation. Third question is who from SA government, particularly River Campus and Eastern Campus, who should be the rep and what would that look like? Anybody want to answer the question? Who do you feel in SA government should be your representative? Should it be the president? Should it be somebody else? Any thoughts?
I think this sort of suffers from the same discussion on the previous question, right? Like who's sitting on it. So I think the reason why, okay, so the reason why SA government is on this is because theoretically we are supposed to represent the students. We were elected for these positions, et cetera, et cetera. There's a question as to whether or not it should be the president or someone else. So the reason it's two students on two spots for the Students Association is because there's Students Association on River Campus and Students Association on the Eastman campus. So that answers, that's to Indy's question in the chat. In regards to like who should be on the rep, I don't know. Like I think that every year there are senators and there are executives who actually care about DPS, and there are some executives and some senators who don't care about DPS. And even now there's some senators that are not like actively participating in these discussions, and they're obviously like people who sort of emerge as the natural choice. So for example, the chair of the subcommittee for equity and inclusion, who would be liaising with all of the communities that are like, you know, I guess like important in any discussion of policing, would probably be the natural pick. I think it might be the case that you would have to let SA government sort of decide who they want. The reason why we have non-SA government students, because normally whenever the university forms a committee, they only pull from SA, which we think is completely unacceptable, given that these issues, well, given that the kinds of students who end up in SA tend to be, you know, like your like stereotype of whoever does student government. Particularly like before the Senate this year, most of the senators were white, most of the senators were male, etc. Right. So like that's sort of why we have this other section of like 2 students from MSAB and then 2 students from historically marginalized groups that would probably go through an open selection process. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Indy? Cool.
All right, great. And people, historically marginalized, oh sorry, I'll look at in his comment. Historically marginalized groups does not include BIPOC.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we can change that to say BIPOC specifically, as well. Yeah, I think the reason, so I think oh, actually that's a really great point. I think when the committee put this together, they were probably thinking that students represented by MSAB would be BIPOC specifically. So that's a question for the committee as well.
If there's no more discussion, one thing to clarify, the subcommittee that Amanda was on about that subcommittee is looking to be established by Student Association government. So if you more updates on that subcommittee itself will be public knowledge on Senate agenda. So we are looking to create a more inclusive board within SA to make sure that we have the right students and right representation, excuse me, in SA that are working on these type of initiatives. So more details on that are coming soon. Moving to our fourth question, which is how long should student terms be for this board? So how long do people imagine students that are selected to be on the board should serve? Anybody want to ponder that question? Feel free to chime in if you do.
Just to add something, so of like originally what would be right now is just the SA president, and it would just be a 1-year term, and they will keep going for every other SA president that comes afterwards. So usually what would also happen is you would get different people coming in at different times, where you still have the same kind of faculty and same people staying. So the students have to get like, they have to be like re-informed of what happened prior, what's been going on as well. So we were wondering if would it be a two-year term, and then we just have to pick out every 2 years? Would it have to be like every 4 years? I mean, that's a conversation we've always been having, and we couldn't really come to a consensus about that. But we were kind of thinking like, okay, 2 years would be good. But we'd love to hear what people have to say about.
Well, if anybody has a question. Also, we're moving to the time where there's any additional feedback. Excuse me, they have a question right now on the board. Is how long should all board members' terms be? That's a good question. Anyone want to answer that?
Yeah, so currently in the proposal, we have 2 overlapping terms, 2-year terms, which are overlapping. So as you can see under undergraduate students, it's always like 2 students representing this. So it would be the case that like every year it would be a new person getting elected while one of the other, or not elected, sorry, getting put onto the board while the other person stays. This ensures continuity, is what we were thinking. This like makes sense. It also prevent like undergraduate students, typically we graduate in 4 years, sometimes 5 years, sometimes 6 years, but we sort of are thinking like, you likely, I don't want to make this assumption, but like perhaps having a first year who just got to college, who is from like, a different country, or perhaps like isn't as familiar with issues as an upperclassman would be less likely to be appointed. You probably have somebody who's a little bit more senior in one of the roles. Even if you're a sophomore, for example, getting appointed onto the board, you have a year to like develop competencies and develop relationships, for example, which is why it's 2 years instead of 1, because we then avoid that problem. And it's not 4 years, because if it were 4 years, then you have like, what if you end up putting in someone who's not the person that you want to be because of various like imperfect selection processes or whatever, and now they're like there for 4 years? Or what if they like don't want to do it for their whole college career? Is sort of like a question. So we found like, we basically were like, oh, well, 2 years seems like it makes sense. I guess an argument could be made for 3 years, 2 overlapping 3-year terms potentially, but 3 years is also a really long time for undergraduate students.
Just chime in, Amanda. So I think the question also looks into like other demographics in this board, not just undergrad, but it's faculty.
Right.
Question is how long all board members should be termed.
Oh yeah, all board members. Okay. Yeah. So currently for all board members in the proposal, it's 2 years. In terms of status quo, it seems like they serve for, I don't know, I think it doesn't, I don't know how long they are there now, but it seems like the people that are on the board right now have been there for quite a long while. Yeah, so Justina answered the question regarding status quo. So if it's 1 year for the faculty and the student rep, because unless you get like elected as president twice, right? Like, then you end up running into the problem of like, there are people on the committee who just pass through. They show up, they're like, oh yeah, what's this committee all about? And once they've sort of figured it out, they leave because their term's up. So that's one of the problems that we want to avoid by extending it to be 2 years instead of 1. And then having that apply to like, you know, all of them. You could foreseeably get like, I guess another question would be like reappointment. Like let's say somebody does really well for 2 years. Do you want to reappoint them? Is that an option that we would like to have as well?
Well, thank you. That's a lot of things to ponder. I think this time frame right now, we have now to 7 o'clock. This is more of a space for feedback and additional questions. So any questions now, even you don't have to be related to what we're talking about right now, but any questions related to this positive review board or any additional feedback that you wish to give, feel free to speak up right now. We can discuss. So any feedback, any questions, additional questions, feel free to say them now.
I guess I have a question to I have a question to Amanda's question just now. Is just like, who would be evaluating those students, like conduct or behavior on the board to see like the success of their abilities on there, to see if they deserve to be reelected? Yeah.
That's a good question. Who keeps the board accountable? Who keeps the accountability board accountable? Yeah.
Potentially, this kind of answer the question. The sub board that Amanda was talking about earlier does look to year by year correlate and make sure we keep basically the sub board Amanda was talking about earlier does look to keep all information, correlate all of the initiative and safety issues pertaining to diverse students in check. So what I'm trying to say is the board that Amanda mentioned does look to regularly update and evaluate all the issues going on with initiatives pertaining to diverse students, make sure they're up to date. If they're not up to date, then we will go about action to improve them. So if the board, sub-board that Amanda talked about sees that the representatives are not doing a job or they're just backing off, then there's ways that we can discuss with other members of the other members of the board to reevaluate one's membership, if that makes sense. That's kind of an attempt to answer the question.
I guess I'm also sort of thinking about the groups that this board would be pulling from. So for example, with the Students Association, like, you know, we have abilities to hold Students Association members, like officials, like senators or what have you, accountable for actions by coming up, like by pulling up a motion for removal, and things like that regarding like, you know, public accountability that like to some extent exists within student government. And I'm thinking along the lines of like, if MSAB were to put 2 students on there, I assume that MSAB would have the power to pull them out. And I think that seems to be reasonable to me. In terms of like this like larger pool of the 2 student representatives from historically marginalized groups, the question would then be, who are they held accountable? Who are they accountable to? Because in theory, they're representing their communities, but then how do these communities have a check on them if they decide that they don't want to actually advocate for communities that they belong to? I think that's going to be a tough question. That sort of ties into an earlier question of like, is it going to be an application process? If so, who's going to be in charge of it? What is that going to look like? What are the criteria? I think it seems logical if we were to come up with a criteria, probably after we bring this feedback back to the board and we're like, hey, here are the problems that undergraduate students have with this proposal, and here's what we need to do something about this. We need to figure something out. It would probably be based on the criteria. So if a student no longer is if a student is no longer fulfilling the obligations that are set out in that criteria, they would be able to be removed. But then there's the who question of who is removing them and who is appointing them, because whoever's appointing them will likely have the power to remove. Yeah. Those are just my thoughts initially.
I have a question.
Mhm.
How is this board sort of like not gonna fall in the trap of like legitimizing the existence of DPS? Because I think a lot of the times these accountability boards tend to be used by like the police to be like, oh, we just need oversight, we don't need to like go entirely and like not exist. And I know like you kind of talked a little bit about like allowing like abolitionist voices to flourish. So um like what would that look like too? So I guess there's two questions are like, what would like allowing abolitionist voices to be heard on this review board look like? And then the second question is like, what is the review board kind of going to do to not like make it seem like all DPS needs is just oversight and like that they actually can stay, if that makes sense?
That's a really tough question, but I think that's really important to address. So in theory, because everything is theoretical at this point, in theory, doing this would allow a democratic element to be introduced into a system that has no democratic element at all, where decisions are sort of just made and people who are not the community and not the students, well, I guess they are technically part of the community, but they're not representing all of the community, are making all of the decisions. So this gives voting power directly to students who are from communities that are directly thanks for typing it in the chat. The students that are directly sort of like dealing with these problems. So what that would look like literally would be, say there's PSRB meeting, or like there's people wanna disarm public safety. That's like pretty simple. Let's disarm public safety. Let's divert their funding to UHS or UCC, what have you. Let's use the disarm example because that one's a little bit easier. So what that would look like is abolitionist students go to their student representatives who advocate for the board, but it also, more importantly, looks like you showing up, not you, I don't mean you, but like students showing up to the public safety review board and being like, we want to disarm public safety, here are all of our demands, here's what needs to happen. And then the board is then, because there is an element of public accountability, is then charged with actually trying to figure out how that can happen. So the issue right now with disarming public safety is that public safety doesn't even make the decision to disarm. It's this board that does. This board and the status quo, the Public Safety Review Board, is the one that makes decisions about whether or not we want to arm more public safety officers or not. So this is directly in charge of those decisions. So if we were to put people who are undergraduate students, who are faculty members, who are abolitionists onto this board, because now you can do that, or like if this gets passed, you would be able to do that, then they are in charge of making that decision themselves. So it's not even that like abolitionist voices will be heard, it's that abolitionist voices can now literally sit on the thing that makes those decisions in the first place. So that's the first, I guess that's like the first part of the answer. How will the board not fall in the trap of legitimizing DPS's existence? That they just need oversight. So this one's really complicated. And I think like even individual abolitionists have a really hard time with this question, right? Like you think about the movement going on across the country. Why are we legitimizing the justice system by saying that we should indict the cops that murdered XYZ Black person, right? Like I think that's a question that everyone sort of has to deal with on a conceptual level. In terms of the board itself, I think like two ways we can counteract that. One, we're going to need to have a lot of public involvement in this board. Like if you want this board to be effective, we need to be watching that board. The reason why we wanted to have a public presentation of what we're planning to do is that typically at the school, whenever people want something to not happen, they just ignore it. And then when all the students graduate, all the students, like new students coming in, have no idea that XYZ thing existed. So ideally, in order to keep the pressure on to continue making progress in terms of abolition and like continue like defunding or like, you know, disarming, right? Even disarming, right? Like what we need to have is this board be very visible. So that's one of the reasons why in the purpose we talk about it being a broad, so it's broad and inclusive, but it should be a venue for independent submission and review of complaints. So all of the things that this board does will basically like be public, such that students would be, or such that abolitionists, regardless of whether you're a student, a faculty member, or a staff member, or a community member, can show up and be like, this is what we want, and this is what you should do about it. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay, cool. But yeah, that's a great question. That's definitely a really great problem that we're going to need to continue talking about in the committee.
We do have 4 remaining minutes in the town hall. If any more question discussion we can answer. Well, I want to thank everyone who came out today for this town hall. We really appreciate feedback and discussion. We're going to take these points that are brought up and take it back to revise and work on this proposal so we get it passed so we can better our campus. We think people facilitators in the town hall will still be sticking around for any additional questions. So you can free to leave if you have to. If you want to ask me questions, we'll be around to answer questions for the remainder of the time.
Wait.
Sorry. My bad.
Before y'all leave, the conversation does not end in this 1 hour time frame. There is a Google form that we will. Oh, it's supposed to be posted. Okay, there it is. So there's a Google form with the actual proposal that you are seeing right now. If you want to look at it deeper and you want to like just look at it in your own time, because I know right now it was like kind of rushed. We will be conversation doesn't end here, as I said. We will be soliciting feedback from more people who couldn't come to this. We will be having posts. Just stay tuned and let people know that there will be posts about this, as well as like we need just more feedback if anybody can bring some more stuff. Yeah. Please save that Google Forms. Spread wildfire. Need as much feedback as we can, as well as the Eastman channels as well, because they're really important in this conversation. But yes, thank you everybody. I don't know if Devon want to continue. My fault for cutting.
No, I have nothing to say, man. My bad. I didn't cut you off. I didn't know you're speaking. No, I think it's really. You may have any more questions we could answer. We got 2 minutes left the town hall, so feel free to speak or feedback, questions, whatever. The floor is yours.
We also want to make sure that this is an inclusive process. So we'll probably do a town hall again after we come up with, after we go back to the committee and the committee starts developing solutions for some of the questions that everyone has. Application process, who's evaluating, how can we like pull people if we don't think they're doing a great job? Where does that accountability come from? And then of course that huge question of like, how are we going to fall into the trap of not legitimizing VPS? Or their existence, right? So, yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Cheers.